Welcome to Bridge Elections FAQ, a live discussion where we talk about your questions about the 2024 election. It's hard to believe, but we are just a few weeks away from the election. I'm Isabel Lohman, the education reporter at Bridge Michigan, a nonprofit, nonpartisan news outlet, and I'll be moderating today's discussions. You had recent questions about polling, electric vehicles, and the latest news. Reporters Malachi Barrett, Lauren Gibbons, and Simon Schuster have the answers. If you have another question for our reporters, you can drop them in the chat and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. You can also go to our website, bridgemi.com, where we have a bunch of previously answered questions from readers. If you'd like, we'd love for you to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss a show. And events like these are possible because of our Bridge Michigan members. If you'd like to join this membership community, you can join so at the link in the chat. Let's get started with some questions to Malachi. Vice President Kamala Harris is visiting Detroit Tuesday. Malachi, what are Detroiters saying about Harris's bid for the White House?
Yeah, so I'm based here in Detroit. I'm part of the Bridge Detroit newsroom. And it's really interesting how Harris is barnstorming Michigan now. She's coming to Detroit twice, Tuesday for a radio interview with the Breakfast Club. And then she's going to be back on Saturday to kind of commemorate the start of early in-person voting in the city. We have early voting centers that are going to be opening up on Saturday. And there's a lot of like events and activations happening around that. And then Obama is coming as well later in the month, 2 weeks before Election Day. I've been talking with some folks over the weekend about this, and for them, it kind of signals a course correction. For months, we had kind of heard from community leaders that were making comparisons to, that Democratic nightmare of 2016, the kind of feeling that voters were being taken for granted, particularly the base of the party, Black voters here in Detroit. And I was texting with a Democratic official this morning who said that the campaign was telling surrogates they may not actually even come back in October. Harris herself wouldn't come back to Detroit in October, and that has changed. I mean, they're really putting a lot more emphasis on Black voters. They released a economic agenda for Black men, and there seems to be a particular battle for Black men. Some polling over the summer and into the fall had suggested that support for Harris had lagged behind Biden in 2020. I think that's part of why you're seeing her go on the Breakfast Club. She's been showing up on some other kind of podcast alternative shows like the Shade Room. So yeah, I mean, I think voters, are enthusiastic to support her here in Detroit. I think there are some folks who feel a little miffed by the campaign's focus on Republicans, who may not love Donald Trump, and undecided voters, whoever that may be at this point in the race. But the campaign seems to have heard that concern and have, shifted their attention back to the city with a couple of weeks left to go here.
And they just released that ad over the weekend as well about, they should be so lucky to be like Detroit. That is a play on something that former President Donald Trump said last week at a Detroit event. Simon, can you talk about what Trump said at that event and how Detroiters responded to that event?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a speech, an address he gave at a gathering of the Detroit Economic Club, where Trump said the whole country will be like Detroit if she's your president, referring to Democratic nominee Kamala Harris. And I think there was little reaction in the room to the statement in the moment, but Democrats and some Detroiters as well, some Detroit politicians made hay with this. They went and said, Trump was casting this as a negative thing, that this idea that Detroit, which he described in 2020 as like living in hell, that whatever fate Detroit is experiencing, that the rest of the country will experience it if Kamala Harris is president. But Detroiters, boosters of the city, are seeing the city in recent years in a very different light. They're seeing, increasing employment in the city, raising wages, rising home values. It's reversing decades-long trends of decline in Detroit that, more than a decade after the city's bankruptcy is finally seeing some reversals on. And so, we had less than 24 hours later, we had a ad come out from Harris's campaign, really emphasizing that, they should be, with a profanity, they should be so lucky to be like Detroit, if Kamala Harris is president, which is why you should vote for her. And I think also that this is sort of illustrating the two sides of Donald Trump that we see on the campaign trail. Even while the Trump campaign is actively trying to make inroads to Black male voters, a crucial population in Detroit and a crucial source of votes for the former president, you also, hoping that he's going to take sort of more strategic, targeted attack in his rhetoric. Instead, you have this version of Donald Trump that also likes to riff off the cuff. the guy who talked about in 2016 or 2017 rather in his inauguration speech about like carnage and urban decay in the United States and him reversing that. I think a lot of his still personal viewpoint of the city is through that lens, and you're seeing that reflected in some of his more off the cuff remarks. This was an ad-libbed phrase; it wasn't included in his prepared remarks. But still, it's something that really resonated. And as Democrats are really trying to, as Malachi noted, make this course correction, this sort of adds a little fuel to their fire. And they're hoping that they can seize upon this and say, here's how Donald Trump really feels about Detroit. Even as he's courting you, maybe he kind of looks down upon the city as well.
How important, Malachi and Simon, how important is Detroit in this election?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important for Democrats in particular. They need turnout to be high in the city. I mean, we've talked about this a lot this year, but just the way that the math works in high turnout elections, Democrats have a much easier chance of taking the state. We're a battleground state. We're very important to the calculus of the Electoral College vote with what it takes to become president. And Republicans have been more open about their efforts to come to the city and try to peel off disaffected voters, try to appeal to Black men. JD Vance was in Eastern Market last week, speaking to, I should note, a mostly white audience, some folks even who had never really been to Eastern Market before. But the chair of the Michigan Republican Party said that, we are actively here in Detroit. We're trying to peel off voters. They've been doing the same in communities kind of connected to the city, like Hamtramck and Dearborn as well. But it was funny. I mean, like the Trump remarks, it was almost like that scene in Avengers with the portals opening. It was like everybody immediately came to like the defense of the city. The mayor had a statement out on social media, like, within a couple of hours. People were like, hey, back off the city. People were very prideful. Tigers were in the playoffs last week. Unfortunately, they lost on Saturday, so that was a bummer. But then the Lions delivered a whooping to the Cowboys on Sunday. So there's a lot of pride in the city, beyond kind of the people who live here too. So it was a weird battle for him to pick there. But in terms of like, the overall calculus, I mean, it's pretty simple. Like the Republicans feel that every voter that they can turn, even if they only get a small percentage of the votes in the city, is going to have a pretty, magnifying effect for the statewide results.
Yeah, and I think that just to add on to that briefly, I think that the messages that you see, we overuse a lot of the times the word microcosm when talking about Michigan elections, but the economic trajectory that Detroit has seen over the President Joe Biden's first term has really played out for these residents. We've seen this huge urban revival and economic, a ton of investment pouring into the city, but it's also not touching all residents of the city. Not everybody's feeling materially that resurgence, right? And so when you hear narratives that are competing between Trump and Harris's campaign about the economy, how folks are doing, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? I think that that's also playing out in Detroit. And as they contest for these Detroit voters, you're going to see sort of these two depictions of the economy and how people's financial fortunes are doing at play a lot too.
And people in the city are quick to point out the challenges and the things that still need to happen here. I mean, it's not like we're ignorant to the high level of crime and some of the other things that folks were kind of pointing out on social media, as a backlash to Democrats saying, well, everyone should be more like Detroit. Detroit's great. A lot of folks were also saying, well, you guys have a lot of problems as a city that still need to be overcome. And that's true. I mean, you go across the city, you talk to Democrats, you talk to Republicans in the city, people are aware that there are challenges here. But in terms of like the image of the city, it's like I think that's why you saw such a quick kind of reaction to this. I mean, people are defensive of Detroit, especially on the national stage. New York Times came to the city over the weekend, did a kind of a tour with Mayor Duggan in a story that ran, I think, on Sunday. That was kind of like a counter narrative to all of the. It was basically kind of walking through all of the things that have happened. NFL draft, the Michigan Central station coming back, all that economic progress with property values. So it's a nuanced conversation. I think it's a lot more than just Detroit good, Detroit bad.
For sure. For sure. So I want to pivot to the Senate race for just a few moments because it's another important topic and one that we expect to be tight, but we are continuing to get more reader questions and we will continue to get to those. So Lauren, you've been following the Mike Rogers, Alyssa Slotkin race for several months at this point. They had a debate last week. They have another debate tonight. We had a reader who wanted to know a little bit more about the Goshen battery plant. This person said, They asked, why are people upset about a Chinese company opening up a plant if the community benefits outweigh the benefits for the company? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and just to preface that, the reason that it's coming up in the Senate debate is because Republicans and Mike Rogers in particular, as well as former President Donald Trump, have really brought this to the fore. And one of the reasons that this has come up is because of national security concerns, concerns that giving money and access to Michigan to a Chinese affiliated company could spell bad news for national security if there are any any connections to the Chinese Communist Party. That's been a major factor in a lot of these conversations. But underlying all of that, it goes back to an argument about whether corporate incentives are the right approach, whether giving money and tax breaks to large companies in exchange for jobs, and whether they're good paying jobs or not. That strategy is something that has given pause to both Republicans and more Democratic leaning folks as well. So that's another aspect of this, just whether providing that incentive to lure companies here when that money could be going somewhere else is another aspect of that conversation. But on the other hand, there is a lot of support, especially among the economic development community, to give these incentives to large businesses. And the argument for EVs in particular is that the market is moving that way, and Michigan could be at the forefront of the technology.
Thank you for that. We also had a reader question about Mike Rogers' residency. We've gotten a lot of questions about this. This person is asking if he was registered to vote in Florida and if it's legal to be registered to vote in 2 states.
It is not legal to vote in 2 states. And to clarify that, Mike Rogers is no longer registered in Florida. The reason some of these residency questions have begun coming up again is there was recently some reporting done about where Mike Rogers is living. He switched his address to a new build in White Lake Township that the Free Press reported not last weekend, but the weekend prior, that that house did not actually have a certificate of occupancy when he voted in the August primary, presumably for himself in the Senate GOP primary. And that is it raises some legal questions, certainly. The Rogers campaign says that he has been living with relatives in the same township. So he argues that he is within legal boundaries. Whether that is challenged remains to be seen. But he says that he will apparently be able to move in as soon as the sewer line is completed and connected to the township. So that's the update now. He no longer lives in Florida, but there have been continued questions about where exactly he's living.
Thank you. And we had a follow-up question from a reader talking about NDAs and Slotkin. Can you just tell us, one, what is an NDA and how is that a play in this race as well?
Yeah, absolutely. That's another question that's come up, and that actually came up as a point of contention during last week's debate. We'll see them debate again later tonight, actually, so we'll see if it comes up again. But an NDA is essentially a non-disclosure agreement, and it came up because there were some non-disclosure agreements that were signed related to the Goshen project in particular. Now, Slacken did sign an NDA for a different project that was being considered in Michigan. As she has maintained that she did not sign an NDA that was specifically related to Goshen, and the NDAs that we've reviewed do appear to confirm that. Apparently, one of her staffers did sign an NDA related to that project to get more information, according to the Slotkin campaign. But essentially, the concern that the Rogers campaign is bringing up is that public officials should not be signing non-disclosure agreements and agreeing to not discuss any aspects of a project that could have great import to Michigan. So that's why it's coming up. In terms of the attack specifically, that there was an NDA related to Goshen. She did sign an NDA. It does not appear to be related to the Goshen project specifically.
Thank you for that. And Lauren's going to be covering the debate as well tonight. So you should be sure to check back at bridgemi.com for the latest on the Senate race. We've gotten several reader questions in the last few days about polling. One person wanted to know the latest polling on the presidential, the Senate, as well as all the tight races. So Simon, could you start by talking about the presidential polling? Lauren, then can you talk about the Senate? And then I want to leave it open to all of you to talk about any other key races we're seeing.
Yeah, happy to. So when you look at the latest polling numbers for the presidential race here in Michigan, the race is tightening. Right now, major polling averages have these candidates essentially neck and neck. 538's polling average, for example, has Harris 0.8 percentage points above Trump's 47%, which means that, there's also going to be some third-party candidate play here. And when you listen to the campaign's talk at this stage in the campaign, we're approaching 2 weeks now that absentee ballots have been available to voters. And so what you're hearing campaigns talk about right now is ceilings. The idea not necessarily that there's persuadable voters that you can bring from one camp to the other, but that they have a ceiling of support, a number of people that they're going to be able to drive to the polls to vote for them. Harris candidates, even as recent polls are showing that Trump is up maybe 1 or 2 percentage points, they're talking about Harris, her campaign officials saying that and arguing that she has a higher ceiling than Trump does in terms of support. And so for Democrats, they're really interested in driving these voters out to the polls. And the same thing for supporters of former President Donald Trump. They're really interested in getting these voters out and bringing them towards voting on election day, since they're not embracing mail-in or in-person early voting to the same extent that Democrats are. I know that we had a reader question about support for Donald Trump's primary opponent, Nikki Haley, and what those voters are going to do. And we saw recent polling that said, about 35% of them are going to be convinced to vote for Kamala Harris in the November election. And that sort of speaks to the political realignments that's going on in both of these campaigns. Democrats over the past 8 years have consolidated support among voters with college degrees. And so that means that they're roping in people who might be considered, conservative-leaning moderates or even traditional Republicans. They're counting on some of these votes to come in. But at the same time, Donald Trump and his campaign are making really big gestures to non-white voters, effectively. People in the Latino community, Black voters in areas like Detroit and Flint, and capitalizing on some of their gains with the working class that the Democratic Party has frankly ceded over nearly the past decade or so. And so as they're sort of each making inroads on each other's camps as we move into the final leg of the election. And it's going to be interesting to see how those coalitions change as we head towards Election Day.
Thanks for that, Simon. Lauren, any insights on the Senate race?
Yeah, it continues to be a very close race, similar to the presidential election. A lot of polls that we've seen show Slotkin with a very slight lead within the margin of error, although there was a recent poll that put them both at 48-48 in a statistical tie. So it's definitely down to the wire. A lot of it could depend, obviously, what happens at the top of the ticket, but it's coming down to, the similar constituencies in terms of who is being focused on, what that means for the ultimate election results. Certainly, Slotkin has been working to appeal to the suburban women that have really catapulted her through some of these close congressional races that she's done in the past. Mike Rogers is really hammering home points about the economy, really trying to appeal to, both the red-blooded Republicans and also those quote-unquote undecided voters or folks who may be leaning, towards the middle on moderate issues, but really concerned about high costs of living. So there's a lot of dynamics at play, but ultimately, it will likely go with whatever the statewide trends end up being.
Thanks for that. Simon and Malachi, any other specific races that you're thinking about or constituencies? I know I reported recently on young voters. Any other groups that you're thinking about?
I'll just bring attention to one group that I don't think we talk about very much, Latino voters in Detroit. I'm very interested to see what happens in the southwest part of the city. There has been some polling to suggest that they are actually less engaged than Black voters. So I'm kind of curious to learn more about that. But I haven't seen a lot of direct outreach to those voters, particularly in Michigan, although we know that there are some communities, I'm thinking particularly kind of around Grand Rapids as well, that have a large number of Hispanic voters. We haven't seen that outreach on the same level as, Arab American, Muslim, Black voters. So what's going on with them? I don't know. Let's find out.
Yeah, I think Malachi's point is a really good one. And at least on the congressional level, two of the races that I think are really going to be the ones to watch coming into this final stretch of the election are in the 7th and 8th districts. The 7th district comprising around the Lansing area between Curtis Hertel and Tom Barrett, and the 8th district between Kristen McDonald-Ribbit and Paul Young, and that's comprising Flint, Saginaw Bay City, and Midland. These are really close races. The 7th in particular is one of the most expensive in the United States in terms of spending on advertising. People are getting bombarded here. And Alyssa Slotkin had previously held this district, and people are essentially neck and neck here. It's going to be a difficult race for Democrats to hold because the district leans Republican. So that's going to be a fascinating race, as is the one in the 8th district as well. But in terms of crucial voting blocks as well, I know you touched on it briefly earlier, but I know you did some reporting recently on sort of where young voters are at in this election, since they were such a crucial aspect of Joe Biden's win here in 2020. You talked to them. What are they saying?
Yeah, there's roughly 1.5 million young people, so ages 18 to 29, registered to vote in Michigan. And if they were to all show up, they absolutely could sway an election. But we've seen in the past that young voters don't vote at the same rates as older groups of people. So I went and talked to high school students and college students and other students who are working towards a trade, apprenticeship, some sort of skill certificate. And they talked a lot about abortion, and they talked a lot about the economy. Several people I talked to said that they were concerned about the cost of living across the board, whether they were leaning Trump or Harris or not even voting in the first place. They all talked about just an influx of political ads, whether that's on their favorite streamers or on their podcasts or on Instagram. They talked about feeling tired in terms of how much content they were seeing, but also feeling like maybe the candidates still weren't necessarily trying to care about the issues that they care about the most. The Israel-Hamas war also came up, so I'll be interested to see what comes from this next. It really spanned quite a spectrum in terms of some people saying, I'm for sure going to vote, and some people saying, I'm just not sure I'm going to.
I know
Yeah,
we
so
have talked about it a lot, but I don't think we should ever underestimate the impact that the Gaza war is having on this race. I remember back in the primary, when the uncommitted movement was getting started in Michigan, there was kind of a feeling that maybe this would be resolved by, October, by the time we were voting on the presidential election. It's probably escalated, if anything. I mean, we're seeing, some pretty horrific scenes over the weekend. This is very fresh in the minds of people. It's affecting voters in Wayne County. We've had a Lebanese immigrant who was killed in an Israeli attack, I think a week or two ago. So that is still going to be, a major impact on how folks are feeling here.
yeah, and when you talk about Arab Americans as a crucial voting group in this election, Americans of Lebanese descent, they're one of the largest blocs there. And so with this new front opening in the war in southern Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah, that's that's going to have, I think, a huge seismic ripple effect on this election. And it's going to be interesting to see where that goes. And I know, last time I was in Detroit talking about different voting groups, I got to interview when I was at a Trump campaign event in a church in the city, a rapper who's pretty big in the local scene, Iswar Vezo. Can you talk to me, Malachi, a little bit about the attempts that Harris's campaign has made to sort of activate some of these Detroit influencers to move away from the inroads that Trump has been making by bringing in some of these local celebrities?
Yeah, it was interesting. I think it was about a month ago. We had a story where they got some folks together. The campaign brought in the only Gen Z member of Congress, Maxwell Frost, I believe his name was, and they basically handpicked a number of influencers in the city who really don't talk about politics much on their pages. It's a kind of lifestyle content, fashion, things happening in the city, people who kind of show off different events and kind of scenes and cultures in the city, and basically ask them to start, getting more involved in this campaign. I don't know if I've seen that really translate in kind of the weeks since. I don't know that I've really seen. I mean, I follow a lot of these people online. I don't see them talking more about how great the Harris campaign is. And this was at a time when, Trump was going online with like the Paul brothers and Aiden Ross and trying to show up on these streamers. And we've seen Kamala Harris kind of double down on that as well. She went on like Call Her Daddy and some of these other kind of podcasts. Some of the traditional media folks are a little miffed that she's spending more time with them, but I think it's clear what the strategy is there. But I think, I don't know. I think that's still an evolving kind of situation. I know that the campaign is really hoping to find kind of more organic engagement there. I just don't know that I've really seen it yet.
Gotcha.
And there's not that much time left for you to see it either. There's 3 weeks left. So I want to be respectful of all of our readers' time. So we have just 2 more questions. One, because we continue to get questions about the polls, I thought this reader question for Simon was really, really important. We continue to get asked, how accurate are polls? How do pollsters find their respondents? How can we trust these polls? This person asked, how do we as consumers who are bombarded with poll information and predictions, how do we know how statistically robust these are?
It's a great question. And I mean, polling survey methodology is notoriously a fickle and kind of arcane science. There's a lot that goes into how they decide which voters are selected for these polls, how many times they should call them back, the sort of questions they should ask. And then also for groups, let's say minority groups, which are less likely to pick up the phone on the first call, they are going to try to oversample those groups to try to create a representative sample. But these pollsters, they generally purchase lists of respondees where they can get as much information on them as possible, try to statistically model their partisan affiliation or get them to say what their partisan affiliation is before they ask all these different questions. But even so, even if you ask questions on the same topic that might be worded slightly differently, 2 different polls can get widely differing answers because people tap into sort of the psychology of how these different questions are worded. We've seen, for example, they asked a question in a recent Quinnipiac poll that, whether Michigan voters or battleground state voters thought there should be federal incentives for EVs, and they overwhelmingly said no. But then at the same time, we had a Detroit Regional Chamber poll that says, if EV project is contested between Michigan and Texas, should Michigan match all of Texas's incentives to win the project? And almost 80%, more than 2/3 of voters said yes. So it shows that sort of while you can try to extrapolate and get general answers about these questions, it often can be pretty fickle. At the same time, in these presidential races, we have a lot of voters which are in the margin of error, which means, if it says that 46% plus or minus 4% in the margin of error, that means that the real level of support is between 50 and 42%. And so they're within 8 percentage points of each other in a 4% margin of error. It means they're statistically tied. And so where you can get sort of a potentially more precise result is looking at some of the polling averages that some of these outlets are putting out, such as 538 or Real Clear Politics. These can get you a little bit closer to the real answer in terms of where these polls are at, and can also often help you avoid outlier polls, one poll that's going to be a markedly different, but not necessarily inaccurate result from what you've seen from the rest of these information.
And when in doubt, readers should just email you, right, Simon, and just say, is this
Always
correct?
happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, happy to answer
Okay.
questions.
And now I'm going to make our head spin just a little bit because I know we're talking about 2024, but there's also 2026. Malachi, you just had a story out today about Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan. He's forming a new nonprofit, and that might signal something in the future. What's going on?
Yeah, so we have, suspected for, I don't know, at least the last year that he was going to be running for governor. You talk to a lot of Democratic operatives, and they're like, yeah, this is kind of the worst kept secret in Detroit that he's going to run for governor in 2026. His term as mayor ends in 2025. And, officially, he has said that he won't be making any announcements about his future until after the presidential election is up. But we have seen some signs that he is putting himself on more of a statewide stage. You can think back to the Mackinac Policy Conference when he was talking about, the state's responsibility to address the mental health crisis and open up kind of more psychiatric facilities in the state. You can think of how he's really promoted the city around NFL draft. Some of the things we were talking about earlier with like property values resurging. He's kind of been telling the story of like 10 years after I came in, here's what we have to show for it. I've kind of, really, I don't want to say mission accomplished, but he's really has a lot to show for the work that he's done to kind of put the city back on track, and has been going around promoting that quite a bit. So what was interesting, we found that a political nonprofit was formed last year and has been kind of quietly seeding positive messages about Duggan's achievements and his policy ideas through a handful of social media pages and a website, and possibly raising money as well. This is a social welfare 501c4, which Simon can probably speak more to, but they can raise money quietly for political causes. They're not allowed to endorse specific candidates, but loopholes basically in election law make it pretty easy for them to actually support candidates. So we reached out to a number of kind of political observers and folks who deal with campaign finance, and they said that this group kind of suggests that Duggan is, being considered as a likely candidate, and is starting to kind of put more messages statewide about the good things that he's done in Detroit, and how he's kind of like, ready for the next chapter, ready to kind of move on, ready to kind of elevate himself for the next political challenge, and that might be fixing Michigan. So we'll see what happens. He's going to make it, more of an announcement in about a month or so, but more signs pointing toward a potential run for governor.
Thank you for that. And super, super quick, Simon and Lauren, any other politicians already on your watch who might be positioning themselves to run for governor in 2 years?
Yeah, absolutely. The Democratic bench is pretty deep in terms of people who are considering names that have been circulated quite a bit, include Jocelyn Benson, Garland Gilchrist. There's a lot of people who are at least thinking about it. It's a good opportunity, and there are a lot of people. The bench is pretty big of people who could at least make a reasonable run for this office. You're also seeing on the Republican side a couple of former candidates, such as Kevin Rinke, Tudor Dixon, looking at getting back in the race for 2026. In terms of other names that have been bandied about, I think John James has been talked about as a possible Republican candidate, but it's still early days. So I think let's get through 2024. 2025, we'll start hearing from a lot more people.
Yeah, I did say I'd make your head spin at that end part. So thank you for that. Well, we are so grateful that our readers spent part of their morning with us. We answered questions about how you can figure out what is a reliable poll, how the Haley voters might vote, how Harris and Trump are trying to get key constituencies, including Detroit voters, to vote for them. We talked about young voters. We talked about a whole bunch of things. You can go to our website, bridgemi.com, for a full recap. You can also go to our website to find our nonpartisan elections tracker and voter guide. We'd also love for you to hit the subscribe button on YouTube. That makes sure that you know about each of our FAQ shows and helps us just make sure that we are getting our content to you. Thank you so much for spending part of your morning with us, and we'll be back next week.